quick show of hands, who came to this just for the title? That's why I wrote it, so it's all good. So I'm the group CISO for Unipart. I'm an ex-ethical hacker. I still do ethical hacking outside of work, participate in a lot of bug bounties, security research, vulnerability research, and my day job is keeping Unipart safe in our logistics, manufacturing and consultancy businesses, and I'm glad to see there's a few customers in the room, so thank you for joining. Outside of work, I do a lot of security research, and part of that research, at the minute, is very much on that hot topic of the Internet of Things that lots of leaders are dealing with, grappling with this challenge, right, of how do we create competitive advantage in our business with all this technology space. And one of those key technologies at the minute is the Internet of Things. So this talk is a little bit about some of the security research that I found in putting this talk together. It actually involved me doing responsible disclosure to 4 different organisations about security issues they had with their Internet of Things implementation. So caveat, it's my opinion, my presentation, not necessarily the opinion of Unipart, but has important ramifications for all of us as we deal with our application of the Internet of Things. So we've probably all heard of these various technologies, Alexa, Nest. Have you heard of Geotech's smart concrete though? So if you're in the construction industry, you can now use Internet of Things enabled smart concrete, which will actually tell you whether your concrete is curing correctly, if there's any early stage fissures, or if there are any problems with the way that concrete has been poured. We've also got Diageo's, Johnny Walker whiskey, who have used thin film technology in the bottle label, not only to tell how that product is made through the production line and if there are any quality issues, but can also tell at what level it was picked up from a consumer in a retail setting, and can even tell when the bottle was opened. So sending push notifications to the buyer on what mixer to have that whiskey with, or whether it should be served on the rocks or served at room temperature. So lots of different applications in the consumer space, particularly for IoT. This one, anybody heard of this, Smalt? So this is the internet-enabled salt shaker, just because. So it will play you mood music or lights. I don't know whether it actually does a particularly good job at grinding salt. That's what they said about the iPhone when it was first released, right? Not a great phone, but does everything else. But we'll see. This is creating a lot of space, particularly for businesses where they grapple with how they implement Internet of Things in their business to generate competitive advantage. And I'm particularly interested in the security ramifications of that, because we're getting into this position where everybody is putting this technology into their organisation. It's creating exponential risk. We've already heard about, cloud is just somebody else's computer. Now, the Internet of Things is just more computers in your estate that you have to deal with, and that creates, has a direct correlation with the risk. So to do that, I'm going to tell a bit of a story about, what I see from a security perspective in some of the research I do. And fundamentally, if you were to just take one slide away from this presentation, it's this one. Most of the implementations I deal with from a security perspective with regards to Internet of Things are simply because the basics were not right. So we talk a lot about the complexity of the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, big data, and they sound great, buzzwords, but in most cases, particularly with the Internet of Things, we're back where we were 15, 20 years ago in terms of security issues. And you'll see that through some of the responsible disclosure stories that I taught you through. Alongside this, we've got a backdrop of some of the most widespread and impactful data breaches and hacks that have happened over the past year. Indeed, if you look at just the data breaches that happened in the first half of 2017, more than all of 2016 combined. In fact, if you're a US citizen, adult US citizen, it's highly likely you've lost your identity or some of your personal data in the variety of data breaches that have happened just in the US over the last year or so. And indeed, we've heard Cambridge Analytica, 50 million users lost some aspects of their personal information through the trust and risk issues with Facebook and its use of big data. The thing that I'm finding, though, through most of these attacks and data breaches is that in most cases, these were well-known vulnerabilities. These were not 0 days. These were not magical unicorn vulnerabilities that nobody had heard about before. They were mostly the basics. So I set myself a question that I was trying to answer in this presentation, which was, with that background, with the background of the data breaches, attacks, and nation-state issues that we've seen over the past couple of years from a cybersecurity perspective, and the drive with businesses wanting to use the Internet of Things, big data, artificial intelligence, what does this mean when these two worlds collide from a security risk perspective? So, we only have to look through all of these historic attacks over the past year or so to look at the impact they've had to just us as private citizens. As I said earlier, the fact that if you're a US citizen, an adult, it's highly likely you've lost some personal data as part of one of these data breaches. So we've got lots to deal with, and the example here that I just want to expand on a little bit is WannaCry, because lots of people would have heard about this. It was widely reported in the press. But it's a really interesting story about how we as organisations become collateral damage when nation states attack each other. So spend a little time just talking about that story. So there was this kind of idea that WannaCry was ransomware, right? Somebody launched this malware to try and steal money, as is the case for ransomware, generating criminal funds. But what is quite interesting about the tools, techniques, procedures, motive, means and opportunity that was used is that it's highly likely it was a nation state actually probably testing out their capability. So to do that, we'll trace back the origins of the story. So this all started with a toolkit that was widely believed to be created by the National Security Agency as part of their Tailored Access Operations team, a capability that most well-developed nation states have, a capability that nation states use to defend themselves against other nation states. But the TAO created a toolkit called FuzzBunch, and this was publicly available. You could actually download it at one time from the internet, and it was stolen purportedly by a hacking group called Shadow Brokers. And Shadow Brokers got hold of this particular toolkit and realised something quite interesting. There was a vulnerability in it called Eternal Blue, and Eternal Blue was used to launch the ransomware that was a key part of WannaCry, which affected many organisations worldwide, most particularly the NHS. And if you read the latest NEO report, you'll see that about 19,000 appointments were cancelled because of WannaCry. So if you were one of the few people waiting for a routine operation during that period, it's highly likely that you're impacted. So the impact to individuals was huge in this particular example. But what's interesting is the NHS probably was never the intended target. And if you look at the code base for FuzzBunch and Eternal Blue, you actually trace back some characteristics that attribute it likely to a hacking group called Lazarus. And Lazarus are widely believed to be associated with North Korea. There are many organisations that have gone on public record to say that. The NCSC, most notably in the UK, Microsoft, the NSA themselves indeed. And attribution is often said to be a fool's game in the cybersecurity world because it's so difficult to actually prove origins of an attack or what specific technique was used. But the fact that these three organisations have put their credibility on the line actually to say it was likely North Korea makes me feel that's probably a confident assertion. But what's, I think, interesting about all of this is that if we were to say WannaCry was ransomware, then patently it wasn't. And actually, all of these organisations were simply collateral damage, potentially, of North Korea proving to another nation state that it did or didn't have a particular capability. So I think this sets a very interesting backdrop for us as organisations over the next few years, that it's very likely we'll see these similar volumes of attacks going on, and we will simply be collateral damage when it comes to the impacts of these particular attacks. So we've got into a very strange position where we've got nation-state malware and capabilities that fall into the hands of organised crime. And we've got this trickle-down, effectively, of where the capabilities that we'd expect to be closely guarded secrets of nation-states are now being used widely by cybercriminals. And many of you are probably aware of the boom in hacking as a service on the dark web. If you've spent any time on the dark web, you actually stumble across these services, often by accident, where hacking groups will actually offer their services for a fee to would-be cybercriminals. And they've actually removed the effort now. The barrier to entry is almost zero, and indeed it actually is zero. I'll show you an example shortly. But we've actually seen an evolution in business models from these cybercriminals where they actually do business and customer service better than us in some cases. So you can buy gold, silver, bronze service plans with your hacking as a service kit that will give you, at a gold level, 24/7 chat support if your cybercrime campaign doesn't work. So we've seen this kind of evolution where cybercrime and the outcomes of cybercrime, stolen credit card numbers, stolen identities, passports, even identity documents, have actually become commodities traded on the dark web. And you read a lot of the research, and you've seen credit card values, so the full credit card number, CVV number, and name was first traded on the dark web for about $20. So you could buy a full credit card number for $20. That's now crashed to about 50 cents if you want to buy a full working credit card number. And the next stage then was, well, we want to compete with this other organised crime gang over here, so we'll give you a refund if it doesn't work. If that credit card number doesn't work, we'll give you another one until it does. So we've gone into a very interesting world where we've got organised crime that not only has a very credible strategy for all intents and purposes, but does back office, customer service, and all the other things that we would need to do as a legitimate business better than us. So we're in quite a difficult position. And I mentioned earlier about the barrier of entry being reduced, and we've seen that with cybercrime as a service, buying these gold, silver, bronze service plans. But there was a bit of a game change last year, actually, and that was Satan. This is a product that you can actually access on the dark web. You just access the onion address using Tor. And this is a web-based drop and drag click interface to running your own ransomware campaign. And the reason this changed the game from a business model perspective is rather than charge you to use this product, they said it's free. It's no cost to you to use, we just take 30% commission of whatever you earn. So we've now got into a position where not only is the technical skill zero, you don't actually need any startup funds now. You can just use Satan and the cyber criminals running this, by the way, not getting their hands dirty, just make 30% of all the stuff that you stole. And as I said earlier, they get back office better than us. So you've got translations to 17 major languages. You've got 24/7 support. You can even send a secure message to the authors if you have any issues with the way it's working. And of course, it takes all of your popular cryptocurrency payments, Bitcoin, Litecoin, Dogecoin, and Banana Coin, should you want to pay with those various cryptocurrencies. And you can see here, all you do is you copy this code into a Word document as a macro and send it to the victim and wait for them to click. And you take 70% of whatever you earn. So we've got into a position now where we're really dealing with some pretty powerful market forces when it comes with stopping a lot of these cybercrime attacks. So this is a really backdrop, and I'm going to talk you through the kind of research that I've found particularly from an IoT perspective. But this message always rings in my mind when I talk about security. And this is Rob Joyce. So he used to be the ex-chief of Tailored Access Operations around at the time when Fuzzbunch was created. And he's now the White House Cybersecurity Coordinator, not yet sacked by Trump as far as I'm aware. But he basically says with any large network, forget the 0 days. We don't use the latest and greatest. Persistence gets us in. We just keep trying. We keep focusing. Eventually we will get in. We'll find the shortest path of resistance. So we've almost got in a position, we're in a position where attackers have zero credibility to lose because they never had any in the first place. We've got all the credibility and liability as the defenders, and so that power, that nexus of forces is completely unbalanced. So there's quite a challenge here. So this led me really to ask the question, where does this leave us in 2018 and beyond? We've got this backdrop of nation states slogging out against each other. We've got huge mega data breaches affecting us as personal citizens. We've got the ex-head of nation states saying we don't even use the real scary stuff to get into these organisations. And we're all busy trying to put more technology and more risk into our business whilst trying to solve all these problems. So I wanted to answer really a few key questions. Where does this leave us when we talk about the Internet of Things? Where does it leave us when we talk about critical national infrastructure? Many people in this room actually are responsible for strategies related to critical national infrastructure. And we're in a position where nation states are saying, or have had campaigns that widely attributed to them in taking down that nation state capability. Energetic Bear from Russia, as an example, was exclusively targeting the energy grid in the UK and US. So we're in a difficult position there. And then thirdly, as you've seen, this nation state capability is now trickled down. And the business model of the cyber criminals is moving more towards a utility-based market where actually there is zero cost and zero capability barrier to entry. So I wanted to set myself a bit of a challenge. How easy could this be to actually get into or understand the security implications of organisations that had implemented Internet of Things strategies? So this led me on a journey of 4 responsible disclosures. So for people that don't know what that means, what it means is when I do any research, as is the case for most ethical hackers, at least those that are ethical, they will responsibly tell the organisation about the security issue. And we've seen this with several organisations where they'll identify a bug or a security issue, tell the organisation, allow the organisation some time to fix it that's reasonable, and then if the organisation is willing and happy, we'll often write these things up and use them as a learning point for other organisations to learn from. So in all of these cases, the organisations were happy for this to be spoken about. They're not attributed to specific organisations, but they were happy for this discussion to happen, really because they didn't want to see another victim. They had experienced or felt potentially the risk that could have happened to their organisation, and they didn't want that to happen to another organisation. So, quick show of hands. Anybody heard of Shodan before? No one? Wow, okay, we usually get a few hands. So this is the Google equivalent of IoT and server infrastructure on the internet. So like Google searches for websites, right, and web content. Shodan searches for web applications, servers, Internet of Things. You can find all manner of things on Shodan. It's completely free to use, and it is as simple as typing in that search box the search term that you're looking for. So you'll see things on there like red light cameras in the US. You'll see control infrastructure. All of these examples that I'm going to talk you through all came from research on Shodan. And I'd set myself a couple of days to do this research, and it took actually about 20 minutes to find these 4 examples. And they go up in ramification to the organisation affected. So the first example was a typical example that you'll see on Shodan and many of these similar websites that look for Internet of Things that are on the internet at the minute. And it was a CCTV system. And this was a CCTV system for a shoe retailer in France. And what's quite interesting about this CCTV is this particular camera is a full PTZ camera. So you can move it around remotely, you can zoom in, you can do all that cool stuff. Anybody recognise what this is here? It's the chip and pin device for the guys that are buying stuff. So, we're in a position here where this organisation has put an Internet of Things enabled device on the internet, unsecured it, and it's provided a fly-on-the-wall view for anybody either trying to steal PIN numbers or who just wants to recce the place before they break in. So we're in a position for this organisation where the risk level is probably minimal, right? It's going to take you a couple of hours of watching and looking for PIN numbers, or if you're really going to steal, a couple of 100 pairs of shoes, fine. The next one is slightly more worrying, and it was one that was found in the UK, again on Shodan. This is a turbine system where the control interface, so the HMI for that control for this particular turbine system, was left on the internet without a username and password. So you could access this particular infrastructure in this case without any requirement to log in, and it was there and accessible. And at the time, this was generating about 7.9 kilowatts, so not a huge system, but certainly probably powering an appliance or a home or something of that order of magnitude. But I had the ability, had I wanted to turn off the infrastructure, to change the password, to disable features. And you can see the picture that I'm painting here, where we move from ransomware that affects data to ransomware that affects physical things. So you can't use your turbine today until you pay me 3 Bitcoins. That's the situation we could be getting in the future. And this is an example of where just the basics, the sheer basics, were not in place that could have prevented this particular vulnerability. And in this case, telling the story about this to the organisation affected, they didn't even know this was on the internet. They had bought this particular product to achieve a business outcome, in this case monitor their infrastructure, but didn't actually know that the maintenance company had internet enabled the HMI interface for remote condition monitoring. So a lot of these risks, in the case of this particular organisation, they didn't even know about, you wouldn't have found on a risk register, but could be found in 5 minutes using Shodan. The third example, again, escalates a bit more. Anybody recognise what this is depicting? Have any guesses? Yes, it is, yeah. So this is a HMI, a human-machine interface for a cement works in India. And at the time, it was making a particular brand of concrete, which I've had to censor out. And this particular manufacturing system was purely just providing visual control. So you couldn't do anything with this, but what you could do is suppress safety messages. So you could be in an interesting position as an attacker where you actually just disable safety and security messages that are coming from this HMI interface, and so actually put operators at risk, or at least remove the ability for these kinds of things to be detected if things are going wrong. So again, in this particular case, not a lack of username or password, but default credentials. So the particular operator of this infrastructure had simply left admin as the username and admin as the password. So the barrier, slightly higher, but not much higher, than the previous example, and this is controlling a cement works in India. And the fourth example, is downright scary, really. And it was a HMI that I found again within that 20-minute window on Shodan. And I don't know if it's a bit of an eye chart for those at the back, but can anybody read those 4 words at the very top left-hand corner, if you speak Spanish? Any guesses? Say again? Yeah. So at the top left-hand corner, you've got the raw ingredients. So you've got barley, soya, maize, wheat. So we know straight away this is a food manufacturing HMI. It's being used to make food at this moment in time. You can see that we've got something here that says name of formula. Again, I've had to censor out what was actually being made at the time, but the various hoppers are showing how that production process is going on. We've got inspection hoppers over here that are being used to take samples away for QA. And I can see the entire process effectively through to packaging and the automated palletization process at the end that's being used to package up the finished goods. And it took me a few minutes just to put some of this stuff in Google Translate, because I don't speak Spanish, right? But I knew straight away this was probably food related. So we know it's a food manufacturing plant. We know it's probably based in Spain. What really worried me when I put the name of what was being made at the time was that it was baby food. So at the moment in time this particular screenshot was taken, this production plant was making baby food for a well-known food manufacturer, and it was not secured on the internet. So in this particular case, I actually had a bit more control, had I wanted to change stuff. So I had the ability here to reset alarms. You know, I can actually potentially look at changing some of the manufacturing process in real time as that manufacturing process is happening. Now, most people would probably say at that point, well, that would probably be detected, right, by the manufacturer. But just think about the reputational damage to that organisation if you have to recall stock because you can't be sure when that change actually happened. So we're in a I think we're in this interesting position where we've got all of this background going on, all of these threats. We're not necessarily getting the basics right when we come to implement our IoT strategies. And we're having to try and quantify and qualify this risk. And we're putting our reputation at the minimum level on the line with some of these implementations. So it was pretty sobering, really, to go through this research. And thankfully, these 4 examples, at least, cannot be found anymore. So you can't find these on Shodan. All of the organisations were very thankful, actually, for finding it as part of the responsible disclosure process. And those risks are now closed down for those organisations. But the interesting point across all of those 4 discussions was that there were genuine business reasons for putting all this stuff on the internet. We would have had, in all cases, a good business case for putting this IoT infrastructure in place for that particular organisation. What they didn't understand was the risk. And this comes back, I think it was alluded to earlier actually, about storytelling to the board. And this is a great example about how you talk about the risks at a board level when we're talking about IoT security. So this really led to me to think, well, I've done all the FUD, right? I've scared you with the fear, uncertainty, doubt. We've got this huge backdrop of security issues and threats and risks that we need to deal with. But how do we actually move on from here? What do we do about all of this? What's the so what? So personally, I really like the NIST framework for thinking about security risk. Because most people, when I talk about defense to them, they're generally in this space straight away. So they're saying, well, we've got some antivirus, we've got some log management, we've got some stuff that we're doing, very much in that protect square, that protect bubble. We know what we're doing to protect the organisation. But what I try and encourage is that step back. How do you know what you're actually protecting in the first place? Because in all of these cases, in all of these organisations, I know through 1 or 2 discussions with those 4 organisations that they took cybersecurity really seriously. They had the latest antivirus solutions, they were using firewalls, they were doing all of the basics we would traditionally expect. But in all cases, they hadn't identified that risk had been created by that particular implementation they'd done. So really, for me, it's not my phrase, but I love the phrase, sort the diamonds from the paper clips. When it comes to implementing an IoT strategy or any technology for that matter, particularly from a risk perspective, understand what is it that actually generates value in the business. Because I can say for sure, for that baby food manufacturer, it is quality. That is their competitive advantage. You know, there may be cost, speed, implications, but the one thing that keeps customers coming back is quality of those products. So we need to do a bit of work, I think, up front when we talk about these technologies and strategies to really understand what is the business problem we're trying to solve, and do we understand what value is created as part of that solution, or what the problem space issue is. So helping the business, from my perspective as a CISO, helping the business understand the risk, but equally the opportunity. So we recognise in the case of nearly all of those examples, we get some great benefits around remote monitoring, big data. We get a lot more richness effectively to our decision making by putting those kinds of technologies in place. But there's an equal amount of risk that we need to cover off as well. And then thirdly, you know, which of the assets inside the organisation are critical? So I guarantee again for that baby food manufacturer, it is the production plant. Pretty much everything else is not in the critical path for the production of that product. There are going to be the supply chain and things that also need to be looked at, but what is the critical asset? And that finally leads on to an approach that we've used inside our organisation from a risk perspective, and that is knowing the difference between risk assessment and threat modelling. Most people, when you talk about risk, they'll give you a great risk log, right? You'll get an FMEA risk log that illustrates all of the risks, what controls have been put in place and what residual risk is left. But what I often don't see is the idea of threat modelling, which is where we actually walk through the technology or the solution as an attacker and figure out how we would bypass all of those controls. So in all of these cases, as I mentioned earlier, they all had adequate control technologies, but they hadn't thought about this thing, you know, at the edge there that was creating effectively a shoot-through to all of the controls that they had in place. So you'll often hear phrases like red teaming. You know, you'll hear about pen testing as an example of threat modelling. You actually take on the shoes of the attacker and try and figure out how you would bypass those controls, how you would get through the technology, how you'd bypass roles-based access control. And that in itself, it is an art of risk management. You're using that to inform your risk management process, but it's a different approach. It's a more creative approach. You're thinking like the attacker to walk through that attack process. And then the second key theme here really is making trust valuable to the business. I remember particularly in the early days when I first started in this role, it's quite a hard conversation to have about standards like Cyber Essentials, ISO 27001. It's difficult to actually say, well, I think we need this. The inevitable question then is why? But what I'm talking about here is if you can use those standards to actually win new business or retain customers that are looking for those particular standards. And these standards apply right down the stack. So you've got management standards like NIST and 27001 that look for implementation of an information security management system. But equally and particularly when it comes to IoT, we're actually now seeing product and protocol standards. So you can buy a HyperCat certified device. You can buy a Thread certified component as part of your IoT infrastructure. And that actually attests that particular component as part of a system has gone through adequate testing, risk has been looked at, continuity, all the other aspects that we need to look at from a risk and security perspective have been looked at and are baked into the product. So I always look for, and you see them particularly with consumer goods. I think in fact Alexa and products like this are now certified against these standards. So we look for any IoT implementations in our business, we are looking for evidence or compliance to these types of standards along with the more well-known standards. And this is all about decreasing variation. So we're using these standards to normalise and reduce risk, reduce the level of uncertainty. And in our case, we're now actually having that conversation about competitive advantage. I can win a customer or retain a customer based on having a specific standard. And then the final piece, which I think is probably as equal to, or in fact more important than the first two, is have a plan in case you fail. So if you classic adage, you fail to prepare, prepare to fail. So have that game plan if it all goes wrong. So we've worked extensively across the business in putting together a cybersecurity playbook. And that is literally a game plan of what we're going to do if an incident occurs, right down to the SOP level. So if you work in corporate affairs, you know exactly what you're saying in a breach scenario. You have the stock text already set up for social media, for your customers, to the regulator. It's there and it's done, and that's just for corporate affairs. We've got the same across all the other parts of the organisation. Crucially, in a crisis scenario, you want to be able to know what you're doing in that first golden hour. It's a phrase that comes from medicine, right? You've got the highest chance of saving somebody if you can intervene in that golden hour. And we all don't want to, none of us want to be the Dido Harding on BBC News in the Talk example. Deer in front of the headlights, not quite sure what we're saying. Start using phrases like sequential attack, which led the security industry to do a huge piece of research. What is a sequential attack when SQL injection was actually meant? So we've done a lot of work, particularly in our business, to look at a playbook for these incidents, and I'd encourage all organisations to do the same. And that really, whilst it gives us some comfort, equally it gives the board comfort, because we'll actually do a war game with the board. And it's amazing, you see the change in reaction to that from when you first start, when everybody's not really sure what they're doing, to the second go when people feel a bit more confident, to the third go when people go, actually I get this, I know what's happening now, and actually removes me from the process to some extent. I can almost walk away and I know this is going to work if an incident occurs. So there's a lot of work to do in preparing yourself for these types of incidents. And that really, I think, was everything for me. There were the three key things that I wanted to talk about. Having that response plan, looking for certification and competitive advantage, and thinking about what is actually creating value inside the organisation and implied risk. So that's actually everything from me. If there are any questions, I think there's probably a few minutes left. If not, thank you.